bring in former CIA military analyst Tara Mahler, senior policy advisor and spokesperson for the Counter-Extremism Project. Back with me, the New York Times' Jeremy Peters and the Washington Post's Mattea Gold. Tara, I'm glad to have you here because I'll tell you, in the last 24 hours, after you heard Clint Watts over on Capitol Hill, you heard him this morning, a lot of open jaws, people's jaws dropping. He talked about the spread of disinformation, the spread of fake news, the sophisticated effort by Russia. So what does that operation really mean? How real is that, and how much of an impact do you think it played?
It's very real. You see Russia taking the lead on these sorts of cyber propaganda campaigns. You saw this throughout the election. More information came out that this is still going on. They cited against Marco Rubio, for example. Right. This was happening all throughout the campaign. And one of the problems, which the Washington Post indicated this morning, is that you have campaign surrogates in some cases picking up some of the Russian propaganda and recirculating these rumors, which is only giving them more traction during the course of the campaign. In addition to that, you have the behind-the-scenes hacking going on, which is really more troublesome. And then there's a third area which we should be cautious of going forward, is if they are able to hack into election infrastructure, election-related tallying or numbers, and we didn't see that in this election. Correct. But that is a real concern going forward. So there's sort of three different things going on: misspreading of information, hacking, and potential problematic cyber intrusion into election systems, which fortunately we did not see in this election. But it is very concerning. It goes to the fundamental heart of our democracy, both in terms of information and in terms of our election system itself.
So what is the U.S., what can we do? Well, I mean, the Senate's looking into this, right? But they're just revealing the information. Are they putting procedures in place, or can they, or who does it fall to try to stop something like this?
Well, on the infrastructure side, right, you need to have resources in place. You need to have strong cybersecurity protocol. You need to have checks on this, people checking to make sure that there are not intrusions on these systems during the courses of elections. On the information side of the equation, it's very difficult to stop this sort of thing. I mean, part of it is awareness, making people aware. And on the hacking side, it's also cybersecurity and also deterring the Russians from doing this. So taking actions in response to this. We haven't had strong deterrence on cyber hacking. We haven't had strong deterrence on cybersecurity. We don't have clear policies on that in terms of how do we actually respond? What do we do?
So it's interesting. You talk about deterrence. Russia is denying any involvement altogether, right? You heard it from Vladimir Putin in that moment we talked about yesterday, saying, watch my lips, no. You heard it from Dmitry Peskov, the sort of spokesperson for President Putin. Here's what he had to say this morning.
Listen, we insist that any blamings that Russia could have been interfering in domestic affairs of the United States is slander. And it has no evidence at all.
Slander and no evidence, Tara.
I think it's more likely that there's a ton of evidence. In fact, there's evidence worthy of 16 or 17 separate intelligence agencies, all concluding in a bipartisan fashion that this was, in fact, the Russians. We've seen this historically with the Russians in other countries, and it's undoubtedly in this case there was Russian hacking. Whether or not it came out specifically from the government or it was directed by the Russians, you know, the intelligence shows that behind the scenes. But I think our intelligence community has presented the evidence, and I think that it's clear the Russians were behind the hacking in the recent election.
I want to bring in Mattea and Jeremy, but Tara, one more question for you, because put it into perspective. How does the testimony from, for example, Clint Watts yesterday play into what we're seeing now with Michael Flynn and with Devin Nunes?
Well, I think the real story that people are going to be looking at going forward is whether or not there was any potential collusion, whether there was any sort of cover-up for compromising information, whether there was any potential blackmail, or whether there was any other criminal activity, whether that's problematic financial dealings. So there's a wide spectrum of things could be going on here. There's a lot of coincidences in terms of timing and Russian meetings. There's a lot of misinformation coming out of the administration. I don't think we know what the actual story is,
right.
But I think we'll hear more once people like Flynn start to testify.
And that's a key point, right? Because we don't know the actual story. There are still a ton of question marks. We want to see, for example, Sally Yates speak publicly. We want to see Michael Flynn and some of these other folks come out and say what they know. Yet the bottom line is, we're talking about this every day, because every day something is happening on it. How damaging, or maybe not damaging, is that?
Well, one of the most dramatic things I thought was raised in the committee hearing yesterday was this idea that Trump himself might have been an unwitting cog in this disinformation campaign by tweeting out information that had, and retweeting information that was coming from the Russians. And it speaks to a much broader national security issue. Put aside this investigation, I think one of the things that really serious foreign policy experts were focused on yesterday, which is that the Russians do not have any kind of partisan alignment. They are in for their own interests. Yeah. And so we saw Marco Rubio had been targeted as recently as Wednesday.
Yeah, just this week.
And this is something that I think everyone is really now taking a step back and thinking about what is going to be next, who's going to be next.
When you mentioned the political implications of all of this. I mean, I think it's helpful to step back and remember exactly how this played out during the presidential campaign, because you had various investigations and scandals bubbling up for Hillary Clinton that in isolation people could very easily dismiss. Oh, the Benghazi stuff, the private server, but eventually this all added up
the
to
totality of it.
Exactly.
How many times do we say the word drip, 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 right?
And it takes its toll, and I think that that's the risk for Donald Trump at this point.
There was one other really sort of interesting moment. You mentioned, I think, a couple of them, Matteo, but there was one where Clint Watts talked about Russians and some nefarious doings. I want to play you that moment here.
The other part that I think we should be looking at is follow the trail of dead Russians. There's been more dead Russians in the past 3 months. They're tied to this investigation, who have assets in banks all over the world. They are dropping dead even in Western countries. These are all huge openings to understand how they are funded by the Russian government. I don't have the capability to do that from where I sit, but I think that's a huge angle.
Conspiracy theory or legit?
I think it is worth looking into. You've seen a series of Russian officials who have mysteriously dropped dead, basically, in the past, I think, 5-6 months. I think it's worth investigating, just like I think it's worth investigating when you see government officials either lying about the purposes of meetings or the timing of meetings or whether or not they happen. It could be that this is all a series of coincidences, but it could be that there actually is more to the story. There is some fire where we see a lot of smoke.
Tara Maller.